Hello everyone, today we make an introductory video about the Mamluks, and this is the first time I talk about them in my on Schwerpunkt, and I, telling the truth, wanted to make a military history video based on the late Mamluk military. So we will partially stick to that, but I realized that since it kind of has a general introductory nature, I could talk about this power in general, because I will definitely go very much in detail into it in the future, bit by bit, because there is really a lot to say, and I was thinking about this, so I realized that indeed Mamluk Egypt is not really a big thing in pop culture, I believe, nowadays. I mean, everybody knows about the Ottoman Empire, everybody has probably even a knowledge, however, that there was Egypt as a power of some greatness before, especially before the Ottoman conquest. Indeed, the Mamluk Sultanate of Cairo was definitely a huge empire, whatever you want to call it, was actually a realm spanning this. It was based on Egypt, so it had it was the heir of the great Egyptian millenary civilization, gravitating around the very fertile Nile Valley, obviously, and this was an area that in medieval times was very developed. I mean, in my videos I always try to kind of stress how excuse me, especially during medieval times, there wasn't really a big difference in terms of economical potential between many areas of the world, and even if you look at this, you know, the major discriminant, you say, oh, well, Europe that was Christian and this Near East was Muslim, and etc. So kind of saying, yeah, stressing the difference between these two worlds. But if you really look at it from a structural point of view, so from a sheer material, productive, economical point of view, you realize that these were, albeit every power naturally had its own character, but there was a substantial homogeneity, and naturally the Nile Valley had presented historically, continuously throughout the world, the Middle Ages, this very fertile area with a very high degree of progressed civilization that was exploited by various powers since the given that we're talking about the Muslims now, since the first Arab invasions. Then you have naturally the Caliphate with them, and think about Fatimid Egypt, and the Mamluk Sultanate. And I confess I don't have a huge knowledge about this topic, and that's partially why I kind of want to stress the importance now of this political entity, because as I kind of underestimated it in the past, not actually a very recent past, because I was well acquainted to this power since I was like at least 16, or but however I had I kind of always skipped that, you know, also because indeed these are things I didn't study in depth. I never had the chance to do so. I have several books, fortunately, about such topics, but I still have, there are too many to read all at once. And I was reading recently about the Mamluk military, and I thought, wow, this was pretty amazing, and kind of forgotten, because eventually we all know that in 1517 the Mamluk Sultanate was crushed by Selim, by the Ottoman Empire, and became to be a part of this huge domination, that however retaining a certain degree of autonomy. This is a bit the key to understand also the politics and the administration of countries in pre-industrial times, especially, not just in those, telling the truth, but you know, historically speaking, whoever had ruled the Bosphorus in recent times had been kind of adverse to Egypt, or tried at least to seize it. After all, the Byzantine, you have to think, in the Eastern Mediterranean, distances are pretty close. You know, actually everywhere there is a sea and developed civilizations, and the two things usually go together, as having access to the sea is kind of a fundamental part of how certain civilizations developed. Distances were quite short. At this time, naturally, today I didn't say that. I would like to stick to the late medieval and even early modern part of the Mamluk military. So this time, essentially the decline of the Byzantine Empire and the rise of the Ottomans, and most of the two powers' resources were invested into this expansion. The Ottomans had initially, as it's known, a much deeper thrust into Europe before they even expanded into Asia and North Africa. The Ottoman Empire was arguably from a geographical point of view, a more European empire than Anatolian one. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So it's not that Egypt came so directly into play, but in some videos I've made, I've already about, especially the rise of the Ottomans, I discussed a little bit how even this major power that the Mamluk Sultanate was, and its story was definitely extremely important also for the development of the Ottoman Empire, for instance. In late times, the Mamluk Sultanate had begun to decline. That's why arguably it collapsed so easily during the during the Ottoman advance. Egypt was at this time, as I was saying before, ruling on a very vast area. Encompassing not just Egypt, I stopped the list before, always digressing, but also it stretched up to Cyrenaica, so in Libya. Then it controlled the Hijads. Importantly enough, the coastal area of the Red Sea on the Arab shores has always been kind of interesting from an economical point of view to control, because naturally there was also some dynamism in there. The Hijads, obviously also had some important cities, some of obviously also the most important religious centers of Islam. So even owning those was very important, just like owning Jerusalem, and especially in this case for the Muslims, of course, and therefore Egypt also controlled Palestine and Syria. So the Mamluks had actually they controlled also at some point certain parts of I think it was called the Al-Tugur, that is essentially this mountainous area of Syria that goes into Anatolia practically. And this had been, Syria has always been an extremely contended territory, as we can see sadly even today, because it's really at the crossroad of so many different worlds. At the time it was so important naturally, chiefly for the trade route, trade routes that came from, because the Silk Road basically stopped there. Yeah, there were other branches of the Silk Road that passed also north. They arrived into Romania, and they passed also through etc. But Syria was, at the opposite end, in this I don't even know how to call it, this Near Eastern area of Mesopotamia, that was connected with the Persian Gulf, with Persia, with China from the north. So it was something very, very important to control, because you could basically absorb all the goods that went eventually to the Mediterranean. So also at this time in history, in the 15th century, in the early 16th century, the world was changing in terms of trade routes, as the Europeans were adopting the Africa and passing essentially from there into the Indian Ocean. And the Mamluks themselves were, and the Ottomans later, when they conquered Egypt, were pretty much involved into this attempt of stopping the Europeans preventing them from going to the east, because at this point the European ships could basically get straight to India, get straight to even Southeast Asia, and therefore coming back home without passing through essentially the Sinai, would be today the Suez Channel. At the time, not where now, but there were other channels that were built since the ancient times. Actually, it was a series of channels that connected basically the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, in the Red Sea, and at this time the Europeans were instead going past that, especially the Portuguese, then the Dutch, etc. And you understand how the net was practically expanding, and diverting the trades from the land route that had been originally. This is why, for instance, at a time, the Venetians or the Ottomans were also stopping to fight, because at this time, and trading, because at this time there were other powers that were competitive, for instance with the Italian maritime republics that to that point had monopolized the world trade with the East practically, because now chiefly the Iberian monarchies and other powers were rising, in Northern Europe especially, were beginning to take their goods away from that route. So what the Mamluks and the Ottomans did was basically to arm fleets and to go harassing the Portuguese, hoping, and the Spanish, trying to to make it too expensive for them to invest in the defense of their convoys. So hoping that the costs would go past the benefits, and you can argue that the Mamluk Sultanate was I don't like, as probably if you follow me, you know that I don't like teleological views of history. That is, so when the Ottomans conquered Egypt so easily, that was definitely an amazing thing, and I mean, chapeau to the Ottomans for that. But it's not that such powers had necessarily to decline, or to. I mean, history could have taken so many different turns. However, historians today, as far as I've read, tend to, I mean, experts on this topic, tend to say that essentially there was a sort of internal collapse of the, especially of the Egyptian manufacturers, that at a structural level had undermined Mamluk power. And this might be a bit too mechanicistic as a thing, but it's important because the Mamluks were developing at this point as a major power in a fashion that was also developing a lot of bureaucracies, a lot of the apparatus. Today we will talk about the Mamluks proper as a military case, essentially, and observing how they were harassing and bullying, for instance, the local administration. We'll see how the Mamluks were, in part, extraneous to Egypt. In part, Egypt was one of those countries that had, in spite of the various dominations, a degree of continuity. You know, as all the great, developed, fertile areas, it's something that everybody wants to conquer, but that ends up to conquer the conqueror in part through culture, through lifestyle, etc. And probably there were some costs attached to this and so on. Then the Mamluks had also to fence off at a certain point the Timurid invasions. I mean, the Ayyubids back in the day, at this time the Mamluk Empire had essentially two dynasties that now I don't want to get into detail with them, but let's say that at different times, for instance, the Ayyubids, I don't remember, it was already the Mamluks, as should check that. Well, they had halted, however, the Mongols. The Mongols were prevented from invading Egypt. forces were one of the few ones in the area that managed to stop the Mongol invasion. It was the Battle of Ain Jalut, or Jalut, I think, in Palestine, fought in 1260. So a moment in which the Muslim Mamluks basically to hold the Mongols, and who didn't make it to Egypt. Otherwise, we would have had a sort of Mongol dynasty also in there. So, and eventually also arrested the Timurids, the Timurid invasion of Syria, or better, the thing got, the invasion got bogged down. Just for saying that the other major player in there was Persia in the area, and as it would remain, even when Egypt was conquered by the Ottomans, the main trouble in the area was this Persian world that, albeit not being so centralized like, for instance, the Egyptian or the Ottoman one, that were arguably much more Western in character, or better, they had inherited a lot of decentralization, the local structure that actually, yeah, they were proper. I mean, in the case of the Ottomans, obviously, they were a Byzantine legacy. In Egypt, of course, this was also partly a Roman legacy, but at that point it was more of a character of Egypt proper. Persia had remained instead a sort of feudal area. There was naturally a certain degree of centralization, but this existed more into the into the Persian into the territories that the Persians managed to keep, especially in Mesopotamia, that, as you understand, there since the millennia had enjoyed this extremely developed civilization with sanitary ones, centralized with cities and all. All this just for saying that actually the Egyptian Sultanate might have expanded at other times, even into Asia Minor. I mean, one of the sometimes the Ottomans, many times actually, the Ottomans could have been stopped in some way. And actually the Ottomans were quite fearful also of the Sultanate of Egypt up to very late in time. I mean, you can argue until they didn't expand fast, they didn't conquer Constantinople, the Sultanate of Egypt was this massive power that could at every time kind of intervene even to Anatolia and cause certain problems. There had been, after all, clashes also, if I'm not wrong, in the 40s of the 15th century between the Ottomans and the Mamluks. But it was I mean, from the Ottoman perspective, at that point, I can't say it was really David against Goliath, but definitely the Egyptians were much more powerful than the Ottomans, that kind of rose very speedily, and this also were pretty lucky, also together, that pretty capable naturally as well. So this is just a general picture about the Mamluk Sultanate and so what about the Mamluks? Who were really the well, it's sometimes complicated to explain, because the Mamluk is often said, it was a slave. This thing, just like the Ghulams, it's in previous times, has been a bit challenged recently from a historiographical point of view, because this idea of slavery is sometimes very difficult. I mean, some of them had obviously servile status. There was a big deal, especially I think in Egypt. This was more evident because it was a more ordered society. It was a less tribal society. But if you move a bit northwards or eastwards, you realize that the origin of these slaves could be really the most diverse. So these slaves were eventually purchased or captured and employed as military retinues. And there had been Mamluks a bit all over the Islamic world as such in the past. For instance, it was a case of also of Spain, but at this point it was mostly a prerogative of Egypt and Syria that were controlled by a sultanate. I think in its real name was in fact in Arab Sultanat al-Mamalik, that is essentially the Sultanate of the Mamluks. I don't know if that was the official name, which I don't think so. However, I think it was much more complicated than that, because once I think I remember to have read it. But it had to become, let's say, in the spoken language, as that the Sultanate of the Mamluks, because the Mamluks had risen in there as something a bit different than slaves. So this thing of slavery had begun ever since the major Muslim powers of the Near East had began to enroll more primitive populations that were mostly tribal at that point. This went with the Turks, especially, that were coming straight from Central Asia, from the steppes, and that began as mercenaries, as slaves sometimes. This was this term gulam that actually defines this kind of slave soldier that excuse me, sometimes was very variegated. Some of these gulams were even Christian, for instance. They came from very wide different areas. It seems, by the way, in the case of the Mamluks, that some of these were mostly also of European origin. I mean, it's not rare to find, I don't know, red-bearded Mamluks at this point. And this also should, I think it's interesting, this video is generally a summary to explain how really complex and diverse really the Near East was. Sometimes, as I was saying before, we say, okay, well, the Near East, it's all like, camels and palms and hot and guys, with the souk and with these markets all crowded, all Muslims, and this is not true. The whole area is extremely diversified, and it was already at the time. And even the origins of these Mamluks are always fascinating, because these areas of the Near East were very much civilized at the time, in the sense that these Mamluks were mostly drawn from the outside, the outer world. They could be Caucasian, they could be from the steppes, they could have a very diverse origin. And it was a bit like with the Devshirme of the Ottomans. I find, although it was a bit different, but in essential, I mean, in the Islamic world, there is this idea of the slave warrior that kind of has also a particular meaning in Islam as a general symbol, metaphor of power, of the relation between the monarch and his. It's not a monarch just like the other. And I think about the Janissaries that were thought to be the sons of the Ottoman Sultan. So the slave was naturally very shaded, and Mamluk Egypt is probably the place where these slaves became something extremely different, and they actually became a knightly class. It's very fascinating. The only similar things I can think about is Germany. In Germany, for instance, the ministeriales were originally serfs, and they came to become the knightly class of Germany during the High Middle Ages. Naturally, in a very different fashion. That's to do mostly not with religion at all, but with certain administrative character features of stemming into Frankish feudalism, essentially. But whatever. Just for saying that, however, it's not so rare. As a matter of fact, you see it's also with the Janissaries that there is a progressive. I don't know how to say that in English, but I would say a gentrification, but more, not just a gentrification, but something that could arrive to the ennoblement of such figures. In the case of so let me check one thing here. Excuse me if I cough a lot. I don't know why. Anyhow, I think it's easy. What can we say about this? Well, yeah. In a nutshell, these Mamluks had become to be the ruling class of Egypt. So not bad for supposed slaves. And this thing, I know from a historical point of view, sometimes it's very complicated even to explain, not because we don't know how it happens, because the trend was these were foreign mercenaries. Doesn't matter if they were slaves or not. At that point, they were still used as soldiers. Eventually, they were settled somewhere. So it started happening a sort of kind of feudal, a quasi-feudal system. Then, in the case of Egypt, challenge was a bit diverse because in the Near East, you never find feudalism proper, unless you don't take some. I don't know if you think about Armenia, that had a sort of feudal class, but that was mostly because it was influenced by Persia. That was instead in the Middle East a properly feudal power. But let's say in these areas, as we said before, it was mostly there was a higher degree of centralization. It wasn't like in Europe where the prevalent model at least was feudalism, and but was something more complex. And for instance, there was a nobility that basically used the Mamluks. I mean, the Mamluks at this point were chiefly formally a military class of some sort. They formed up the retinues both of the Sultan and of the amirs, or emirs, I usually want to call them. That would be the local nobility. Like a bit, the aristocracy in Europe, all these barons, dukes, etc. With the difference is that first of all, some amirs were actually drawn from the same Mamluk retinues, especially from the royal Mamluks that were naturally the favorites of the Sultan, and they formed up these retinues. Although there was a sort of quasi-feudal system for which the amirs were entrusted with certain fiefs, let's say, to which corresponded a certain amount of Mamluk retinues. However, part of these retinues couldn't be brought together with the lord. So if the Sultan wanted to remove someone, an amir from somewhere, he could not be followed by the Mamluks. So this was something that Europe, in Europe had not been able to be done because nobles had much greater prerogatives. This was instead a world that was a bit more fluid, and into which central power could a bit more direct better the centralized control. There is to say, however, that not all the Egyptian forces at this time, or Mamluk forces, as you want to call them, were made up by Mamluks. Now we'll see it, but even the retinues of the amirs, sometimes that were prevalently made up by Mamluks, especially in origin, were of the early Mamluk period were made up by local retinues of some sort that had not to do with the serfs, the slaves. So, what else can we say? This is important, and probably we'll discuss this a bit further. Essentially, the Mamluks had an extremely, the Mamluks, now I'm talking about the Sultanate. The Mamluk Sultanate had an enormous chivalrous character in military culture in general. Now, this thing of chivalry in the Islamic world is something very ancient. You can argue that the Muslims were especially let's say that a chivalry culture existed before the Muslims as well. The Muslims mostly got it from Persia. They were these models of essentially feudal models that had produced into Persia much before than Europe a feudal and chivalric culture. These were exported a bit everywhere. You see that in Spain, when the Muslims conquered the Iberian Peninsula, there was a great deal also of literature and that emphasized this character of nobility, of chivalry. It was associated mostly with the youth. The Islamic chivalry had a bit. It was slightly different from the Western one, but nevertheless it had a massive influence also, on especially the literary models and forms of even the same chivalric literature in low medieval Europe. Although European chivalry actually comes from something very different and possibly even more substantial, definitely, than the Islamic one. Because it was reinforced by, Europe was still I can't say tribal at that point, because obviously there had been the Roman Empire. The Romano-Germanic world was a bit relatively different, very different from a tribal society. But whatever, I discussed extensively on these topics. Maybe if you're interested, we can, if you on Schwerpunkt, there is the, you can search with the there is a space when you can look for a keyword and searching for that, you put chivalry, you should find a lot of results. I think, or however, a substantial result. So if you're interested in knowing what my opinions about the origins of European chivalry actually are. But what I was saying is, however, the Islamic world, and this is something that the Crusaders really witnessed, had a very well developed chivalric culture, and this chivalric culture had been mostly emphasized by the arguably by this injection of external elements, like these slaves coming especially from the steppes, could be, because these were horse riding peoples. Even the Mamluk Egypt had several injections of these populations. These Mamluks, you could trace a sort of continuous process for which, ever since the same birth of the Islamic powers, these began to hire horse riding peoples from this still tribal or feudal world, as you want to call it, between the Caucasus and Persia and the steppes, etc. So these were populations that had a very strong military edge based on cavalry. So the main arm at this point of so consider this, then consider the Persianization, Persification, how you want to call it, of the whole Islamic culture, especially in the Near East. Think about even the Abbasid Caliphate was extremely influenced by Persian political, military, and cultural models. So it had produced a great emphasis put on the cavalryman as an aristocrat, as a mailed fighter. What do you and I think it is amazing what you see in Egypt, that, as we were saying before, was a relatively strongly, I'd say, sedentary and bureaucratic and centralized state, is how the Mamluks were able to bring into a very strong sense of chivalric culture that definitely existed also before, so I don't want to say that. And plus, even in warfare, this is something actually that it is debated, because there is not enough evidence, but the few that we have tells us something very important from his point of view, is that the Mamluk forces were based mostly on cavalry, at the point that infantry was considered even something rare. There is probably also another explanation for this, as Egypt, as it's evident, is surrounded by populations like the Berbers and the Arabs that still lived into a sort of semi-nomadic pastoral fashion, in that entailed a lot of mounted warfare at that point. So in fact what you see is throughout the whole Egyptian Middle Ages is that the armed forces were largely made up also of cavalry. I recently made a video on the battle of it was a 2 hours video long. I mean, really aging, not remembering what was the Battle of Ramla. The one fought in 1105, because there were several. Well, in that case, you see that the Egyptian army was a pretty had a lot of mounted components. Both native Egyptian heavy cavalry, with this component of even it was probably the shock one, the one that had been developed in a sedentary society, and maybe that had lost a bit of the original. Well, I don't know what I'm saying now because it's too complicated. And it's not even important, but I mean there were lots of Bedouins, for instance, and as well as Turkish horse archers. Although in that battle infantry was very important, even though it was not Egyptian infantry, it was mostly Sudanese infantry. Just for saying that it happens frequently in Egyptian armies to find basically all mounted troops, and this is important because it's something we also get from the same Mamluk chronicles. Maybe external sources tend to say, okay, well, there was a bit more of infantry. Probably instead the Egyptians were, at this point, at least the Mamluk historiography wanted to stress the importance of mounted combat. This is something that happened also in Europe during the 13th century, especially when there were certain infantrymen on the field, but those who wrote the sources were so much soaked with aristocratic ethos and this chivalric culture and ideals that they kind of neither named these fighters because they were deemed to be kind of inferior or not important, and everything revolved around the knights, etc. So even in there we kind of get this, but I think it's still very important, and some people argue that the Mamluks at this time had even a more cavalry orientated army than those of Persia and the Ottomans, which is I don't know how to say that. However, aside from really trying to define this, it's still very important that the whole area, let's say this kind of Near Eastern and North African world, was extremely influenced by cavalry warfare. However, it is true, arguably the Ottomans probably made a less, at least from a numerical point of view, probably they made a less extensive use of proper Turkish cavalry, although even in there probably it's been a bit underestimated. But however, the Ottomans, especially when they start building a permanent army, that is essentially the Janissary one, they try to put a lot more emphasis on infantry than their Persian or Egyptian counterparts, and this is often overlooked because in turn, in comparison with the Europeans, the Ottomans had less infantry, or at least they had less strong infantry, and therefore what shocked the Europeans at the time was mostly this very dynamic light cavalry that, however, was not even necessarily Turkish. Sometimes these cavalries were European themselves, as in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe it was plenty of mounted fighters and mercenaries that could be hired like that. So yeah, I think it is really really important to stress. Then now I could add details about how these guys looked, etc., but I think I'm gonna leave that from when I will discuss about the equipment of the... What I would like to talk about now is really the composition, broadly speaking, because that will, however, I will make a video dedicated specifically to that, but how the Mamluk army was organized between the 14th and 15th centuries and the beginning of the 16th, so in the very last days of the Mamluk Sultanate. So first of all, there were essentially three elements of the Mamluk military. First of all, the royal Mamluks. These were called in the local tongue Al-Mamalik as Sultaniya. So I guess it, even without knowing a word of Arab, that this means simply the Sultan's Mamluks. And in fact, they were they were really the royal guard. And in here, it seemingly there was a sort of diversification. Now I don't have time to go into detail, but what is important about these Mamluks is that all the areas associated to them still involved from a cultural point of view this differentiation, ethnical differentiation. And as far as I understood, there were certain ethnical repartitions of these, especially these more institutionalized military corps that were essentially mindful of their own ethnical origin. Seemingly, there were, for instance, lots of Circassians among them. And this doesn't mean that there were actually Circassians. This is something that happens all the times into military history, especially at this time when there was a more a slow passage from a sort of feudal and tribal warfare into something more centralized in a modern fashion, that a unit took the name from a certain population, and that eventually everybody joined, so that it's not that these were ethnic, whatever they were, in this case Circassians. I talked about this, for instance, a lot when talking about the Polish army recently, that had a lot of corps that were created after a certain ethnical contingent, and that eventually were filled by people who had nothing to do with that ethnic origin. But it's perfectly normal. It happens all the time, also in Western Europe. Just considering that the more multi-ethnical it is an army, and the more these things are likely to happen. So the second corps, no, it's not really a corps. The second say part of the Mamluk military was it was not the second, just the second in our list, but were the Amir's retinues. So the Mamluks that belonged to the Amirs. These were called Mamlik al-Umara or Aitnad al-Umara. And finally, a kind of lesser kind of troop that were recruited in a sort of I can't say feudal system because it's wrong, but however they were rewarded with certain lands. There was this mechanism was known as the al-Alka or Ainad al-Alka. So these were troops that were actually weren't Mamluk at all, and they mostly were made up by native Egyptians or Syrians or whatever subjects these were. There was still here all these armies, as we're saying, all these troops had a very high level of a degree of mounted fighters in from a sheer numerical point of view. The Alka was also with a lot of cavalry, but there was also some bit more of infantry, given the kind of military organization. Although this system, there was probably originally I don't remember actually when it was institutionalized by the Mamluks. I don't know whether it existed already under the Ayyubids or the Fatimids. I will have to look at that. But it was something from the militia. It was kind of halfway between feudalism and militia, because these were originally rewarded with something. We have seen it, while there were other troops all over the Mamluk Sultanate were recruited instead through the normal, let's say, levy system, and were presumably regulated according to the local, tradition, how the Mamluks interacted with the local populations, and all these corps were made up chiefly by cavalry, but there were also infantry troops, definitely, and artillery. We will close with artillery today, talking about the Mamluks. That showed certain interesting. Okay, so for now, I think I will skip the whole organization of these troops. Just say that. What about the quantity of this? What about the military of this Mamluk Sultanate in quantitative terms? I mean, how many they were? Well, the Royal Mamluks. You have to think these were not really permanent armies yet. I mean, there was a degree of permanence in the measure to which certain of these troops were ready, combat ready, and they were rewarded with a certain amount of land, so that presumably they were easily trackable. They would have to participate to the army, but it was not permanent bodies of troops. So we're not still in a time where this. But yeah, in small numbers, surely there were. But as an army, this wasn't as such. So aside from this kind of evidence, what we know and we can also legitimately presume is that the numbers varied wildly, and it seems the Royal Mamluks here were in the range of couple of thousands, more or less. As I was saying, this could really vary a lot, so we could arrive even to higher numbers, even to 5,000, etc. And you have to understand that naturally these were kind of armies within the general military. I mean, the Royal Mamluks had their own organization, certification, specialization, etc. So that we're talking even about very wide, very diversified fighters, kind of fighters in quality, in functions, etc. The Amir Mamluks were probably way more, but not excessively. Also, these kind of varied really much, and there are also certain estimates that are simply based on the numbers of the amirs that existed into the Mamluk Sultanate, for each kind of district, and these had some troops. So the numbers, and these were, by the way, they were scattered all over the Sultanate. That, as we've seen, was pretty large. It stretched from Anatolia to Sudan, and so these were local troops, and they naturally also served the purpose of defending the Sultanate on a local base. It's seemingly at the beginning of the 14th century, the Amir's troops were actually pretty large. We might be talking about the 13,000 in total. Then there is a steady decline that similarly touches the bottom in at the end of the 15th century. So actually pretty late in time. And there is a huge increase, similarly also due to the degree of militarization of the kind of threats that now the Sultanate was facing in the very last years of the Sultanate. By this time, it seems that the Amirs might have even arisen once again. I mean, by 1486, these had arrived to like 2,500. In between 1512, 1517, So the end of the Sultanate from 7 to 8,000, possibly even more. Naturally, these made up the bulk of the army. It was just a bit like in Europe. The kings, the princes had begun to have their own private armies that had also a good degree of starting to have a certain degree of centralization, so sort of permanent character evolving towards the Renaissance. But still, the largest numbers were fielded by the nobility, and this is pretty much everywhere. In you see, it was in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the Near East. It was just like that everywhere, and it naturally corresponded to the need of this larger dominations towards the end of the Middle Ages to start building something, a military that could be available for the sovereign or whoever was in charge, and not just to rely on the nobility. So here it begins the process of centralization. This was due to many factors, actually. We can't discuss them now. But it's interesting, especially it seems that gunpowder gave a great impulse to such transformation. Naturally, you have to understand that together with these troops was plenty of things like mercenaries, other tribal levies coming also from very different lands. There were black troops this time in Egypt that were drawn, and they were actually poor. They're usually deemed as poor in quality, but sometimes for instance, the sultans equipped towards the end of this period, towards the 15th century, actually a unit of black slave arquebusiers. And these are kind of one of the first. They're actually the first bodies of the Mamluk army specifically organized with firearms. And these firearms actually were not even usually produced into Egypt, or better, there was a very strong influence at this point. I mean, Egypt at this point is credited to have been sort of backwards in many ways. I mean, it was a very large state, but very corrupted. And in terms of military, I mean, the technologies surely were there, but sometimes there was not the will of reforming the army, of reorganizing it. Firearms were sometimes bought by the Europeans, from the Europeans, sorry. So that, I don't know, the Venetians, but it should be pointed. So there were arguably, especially on the Mediterranean coast of the Mamluk, a lot of pirates and people who kind of traded with and fought together with the Europeans, and were a bit more versed into this kind of, and in fact of using fire and handling firearms. And in fact, it seems that at a certain point the Mamluks begin to hire these bands that were pretty unruly, etc., but they knew how to use firearms, and they usually used them to defend coastal centers, citadels on the sea, and stuff like that. Because one of the major problems of Egypt had always been actually that the enemy could arrive from the sea. And the Europeans launched crusades into Egypt, also pretty consistent forces back in the day. And in fact, the core of the Egyptian territory was in the north, as it's known. Even Cairo and the most developed areas are in there, so very exposed from the sea. And in fact, what you see that is that a lot of worry of the Mamluk government was to reinforce their coastal centers and fortifications, because they cared pretty much about not being invaded by some another maritime power. And as there were used to be assaulted from that direction into the very heart of their territories, and this gave the impulse also to start using a naval artillery. Telling the truth, just for telling you how technology is not something that magically pops out. First of all, it costs a lot. So you might have a country that naturally has the know-how of using certain technology, but not necessarily the resources at a certain point or the political conditions to make military reforms, to invest in a certain field, and to create these professional armies. This is especially because that's the real problem. And this is instead what the Mamluks tried to do, definitely too late, when they especially began to fight with the Portuguese and the Ottomans to be eventually conquered. But if you see, during the 14th century, the very first powers that had been on the lead of military technology had been Venice and the Mamluks. I mean, the Venetians and the Mamluks, for instance, immediately developed naval artillery, explosive shells, etc. So this was probably the average, and we don't have to think of oh well, the Mamluks now, they didn't have a siege train, so an artillery train, so they were so backwards. No, they weren't. It's simply that they hadn't organized the army in that fashion, but they surely had the know-how, and those were some of the most technologically advanced areas of the world. In part, now the Europeans were probably getting a bit ahead. The guys who were really keen, extremely developed into especially artillery, were the Ottomans. But also these, even if they were quite eager to adopt firearms, it kind of took a while before they managed to fully integrate it into the armed forces. But they were never, enemy of that. There might be a point that I just thought about, and that it is really not to be underestimated, because as far as I could see, it might have a very important impact. It is essentially a cultural distrust towards firearms. This is something you find in part also in Europe. I mean, this condemnation of firearms as a sort of an unloyal weapon that kills without honor, without courage, etc. And the countries like, especially certain Muslim powers like the Golden Horde or Persia or even Egypt, and here I'm just speculating, but it might be true, were very much keen on this chivalric culture of mounted combat. And since cavalry was so prominent into Mamluk armies, I believe that attached to this there was also a relative form of distrust towards firearms, so that it's not that they didn't know how to use them or that they were there in the first place, but they simply didn't want to change their military in a fashion that could make... And the reason here is not even strictly cultural. It's really political. It's really about the degree of control that the public authority has on how the army is developed. Because having especially in this time, in the Renaissance, we're talking about 1500 here, at the end of the Mamluk Sultanate, is if you are going to be an updated power from a military point of view, you need to invest a freaking lot of money, as never before had happened, into the modernization of your armed forces. So starting to use firearms that cost a lot, having an artillery train, having arquebusiers, and starting also adapt the rest of the army accordingly, especially starting to use large bodies of infantry as well that can move in an orderly fashion. And arguably the only power that in the Muslim, at least in the Near Eastern world, that could do something like that were the Ottomans, because they had a much higher degree of centralization that I think not even the Mamluks enjoyed, nor the Persians naturally. And so because and this entailed naturally that in order, first of all, to field such a modern army, you have to hire taxes. You have to impose it on the communities, and these communities, if they're particularly powerful, like it could be the Mamluk amirs, they would have said nuts. Okay, they would say no, we don't want, because we don't want to pay taxes. But they would not tell that. They would simply say, not only we don't want, but this is also ideally against our chivalric, a chivalrous way of warfare. They essentially mounted combat, and what are firearms? They're a cowardly weapon. They're something that kills a man from the distance. It's not a fight. So all these balances could explain the reason, together obviously with the corruption, the political, the general decline of the Mamluk Sultanate. One of the reasons why eventually the Mamluks adopted firearms at a unit level in a fully organized fashion so late, and why especially it was not enough, especially to counter the enemy. Also because at this time, arguably it's not that you need firearms to win. You just need them not to lose, or at least try not to lose. But even in here, firearms are not really the answer to everything. It's not that firearms now made literally the difference on the field. They were not the decisive element that you still could effectively utter tactics, but they were necessary also, and especially from a strategical point of view. If you wanted to invade another country, to besiege citadels, etc., the firearms could help you a lot with that. However, even tactically speaking, this had a great impact. For instance, the Ottomans won the Persians in a few years afterwards at the Battle of Calderan, seemingly using effectively these firearms tactics that surprised the Persian cavalry, that instead was in this sense very traditionalistically close to the feudal mounted combat. This is something that happened in a lot of places during the 16th century. Think about when the Russians began to expand into the say Siberia, against all these Tatar populations that were horse-riding peoples, and when they met the Russian pike and shot tactics that had spread from the West, they couldn't basically solve the tactical problem because they didn't have the other ways. They had not adapted, and that is kind of normal in the naturally in Siberia proper, where there were just scattered tribes and all, but there were bigger political entities like the Khanate of the Golden Horde, or indeed powers like Persia, etc., that had lagged behind at that point at a structural level, because partly they had refused, or at least they had not been ready to, just like the Mamluk Sultanate, modernize towards that direction. So this is an interpretation. I'm not telling you it's correct, but kind of makes sense by certain standards. And don't get me wrong, actually the Mamluks had firearms well before the Ottomans. As we were saying, together with the main Italian powers, they immediately adopted these new technologies, because those were the places in the Mediterranean where the greatest advancements were done. And it's a shame, telling the truth, that in Western historiography we personally concentrate so much, I mean, at least we have in the past, mostly on this kind of Western perspective. Like if you want to study firearms, you mostly go look at, I don't know, the 100 Years' War or the armies of Charles the Bold of Burgundy. But if you look at the Mediterranean, well, that's where you have to look at even before, because in the case of France and Burgundy, etc., those were mostly this is a brilliant example, because that's the example of when large artillery trains were built, and that's because these were big states like France, like Burgundy. But in terms of the adoption of firearms, you realize that it was actually the Mediterranean where this began. And if you look far east, even in China, you realize that pike and shock tactics were actually being pioneered in there in the same period before the Europeans did, even from the late 14th century. And this is, I think, another of the frontiers of warfare, of military history in terms of research, that archaeological finds are telling us that the pike and shock tactics that we mostly associated to the Western warfare of the Renaissance was being developed at the same time into places like China. And this is not at all surprising, because as we were saying at the beginning of the video, certain powers are pretty compatible in terms of material culture, of availability, and naturally such a big power like China, that would remain essentially the largest global power until the 18th century, was the only one. Yeah, it was not the only one, but the first one who would invest towards that direction. And therefore there's a frontier of military history that has to be studied to really understand. And it could be that Europeans also were partly, that these two areas of the world mutually influenced each other, because by the 15th century, trade was starting to get pretty international on a regular basis, and this knowledge, were actually shared at the time. So this is another bit of a digression, but just for saying that having the know-how for a technology doesn't necessarily involve the ability of producing that technology. You still need the resources, and also you need the doctrine, that is essentially how you are going to use that technology. Because if you're a traditionalist, you could even lack interest in some measure to do that, or at least maybe that society is not so prone to adopt certain new types of organizing, because organizing an army is chiefly a political and social problem, aside from the economical one. And it's not, how these armies evolved in ways that are firstly happening. In history, there's never been a guy who says, okay, let's design a new army, and then so it followed. No, armies always change by themselves, and they're always, you can argue, they're always ahead of their times. And then it takes a military genius to say, okay, we have to reform now the army, kind of trying to rationalize and to organize this new way of warfare into an efficient way. And that's where doctrine enters into play. But it's not simple. It's not really simple, even though that comes also through practice. In fact, you see that some of the greatest reformers were not guys who sat, in their don't let me say, but there were actually generals who had led those armies and knew how they worked. Although you also find certain theoreticians of warfare that kind of got it right, but maybe they didn't know how to carry a reform out, which is also another problem. You need also to be a good organizer and a good planner, and many great minds. Maybe they're extremely intellectually developed, but maybe they're not so pragmatic and they're not so capable in practice. So, in spite of these pre-regressed development of firearms, as we have seen, the Mamluks were eventually defeated, and there's this battle of Al-Raidaniya in 1517, where the Ottomans defeat the Mamluks. At this battle, seemingly the Mamluks had brought lots of big immobile cannons, because, by the way, this was also a bit of the problem of early cannons. I discussed about it into the modern warfare playlist recently. The I mean, new forms of there were many varieties of cannons, and usually cannons had began to be used, especially these big monolithic things, chiefly aimed at tearing down citadels. Arguably, handguns always existed, but initially, a crossbow was better, definitely, or even a bow. Then eventually, towards the end of the second half of the 15th century, you realized that there is an increasing diversification of also the type of cannons, and you can argue that the most advanced military powers at this point, at least in the field of artillery, were the ones who had a greater differentiation of these, I think, while the others were. And this is also probably, once again, a socio-economical matter, because what you see, for instance, in Europe, that was pretty florid at the time, or at least was rising very consistently, is that firearms were used in all places, and this probably was due also to the political fragmentation of Europe, so that every single principality started to build its own guns, because the political fragmentation entailed also endemic warfare. When you find these bigger empires, you see, and where there is a higher degree of centralization of it's easier to track this updating problem, because it's really the central administration that should provide for this transformation on a regular basis. So it's obvious that even the Mamluks, as we will see now, had even the Mamluks Mamluk amirs had been building their own artillery, their own private armies essentially. But the whole organization of the Mamluk military mostly stuck to these big pieces, these big guns, and not really developed, or at least it couldn't draw so many smaller guns of varieties and sophisticated doctrines of employment in this place. This is also pretty debatable, but the Turks that conquered the at the Battle of Raidania, for instance, the cannons were used to defend field work, and the Turks really didn't have a big deal of problem with them. Surely in the Mamluk army there were smaller firearms that existed. We have seen before that unit of black slaves that were equipped by the Sultan with these arquebuses. But they seemingly weren't such high. They didn't have such a huge, high quality of troops, and this is something I really understand, and that doesn't have to be stigmatized, because when you have a military tradition that really functions in a way, and it is probably also pretty good. Mamluk cavalry at this point, for instance, was substantially strong. There was all a tradition, all a continuity, etc. So what's the point of spending lots of money on these firearms, especially when they're used in small numbers? I mean, what effect are they really gonna have on the field? One thing is saying, okay, because that can be also as a show off. You're the Sultan of Egypt. You fancy these new technologies. You love them. You want to show update, etc. So what you do, you create this small a unit of 500 black slaves that are all in this sense uniformed under your organization. You keep them with arquebuses, and then what? And how do you think that's gonna make a difference? At this time, for what we know, even 500 crossbowmen or 500 bowmen or other type could be more effective, especially if they were well trained, especially if were drawn from places like I don't know Sudan, that had, for instance, seemingly a good tradition in bow use and hunting. Excuse me, I drink a little bit again. And so we can't say really that the Mamluks were extremely interested in this change, and they mostly relied on artillery. That was on the big artillery, the big guns, that were seen as also useful, not just for pitched battles, because definitely at this time, yeah, artillery was starting to become kind of a constant into warfare, also in pitched battles, but the effect was still pretty much reduced, while still was pretty useful. It was mainly conceived for siege warfare. So during pitched battles, the idea at this time was, okay, we have these guns, let's use them anyway, you know. And a certain doctrine about field artillery was definitely being developed. I mean, especially the mobility at this point of the cannons was really a problem. For instance, under the very sultan, the very last sultan of Egypt, Tuman Bey, there was this attempt to use some more mobile firepower. And this happened also actually at a smaller level. For instance, mounting arquebusiers and light artillery on ox carts, and also to use camel guns that were never something very effective, because the beast is gonna freak out. Having first of all, it's gonna get extremely tired of having a gun on his hump, and secondly, just think about shooting. And but these are kind of modest, humble solutions. The history of warfare was not heading towards that direction. I mean, mounting, especially arquebusiers on ox carts, is what for? It's something that was fine, and for 50 years before. Think about the Hussites, or Hussites, I don't know how you call them. But it was kind of declining in part. It was still used in Hungary, in other parts of Europe, because paradoxically the Hungarians eventually, after suffering all those defeats against the Hussites, they started adopting these tactics with these carts loaded with firearms, etc. But we are in the Renaissance now. The Europeans at this point are inventing something completely different. Pike and shot tactics, squares of pikemen supported by increasingly supported over time by firearms. We don't see it in the last days of the Mamluk army, while we are seeing it, for instance, in the Ottoman army. They didn't make surely a big deal of use of pikemen, but definitely an extensive use of arquebusiers. And the Tüfek rifle was used. Actually, Tüfek means rifle, but it was something it was spreading in the Ottoman army. Although sometimes also in here, as I was saying before, the Ottomans are credited with adopting easily firearms, but if you look at the numbers, it was probably a much slower process. I mean, they adopted it without particular problems. They also pioneered, especially at this time in the 16th century, other artillery technologies, such as chiefly the granulation of the powder. It's not really how big your guns are or what kind of the quantity of them. The Ottomans began to surpass everyone because they had the best powder that could oxygenate much easier with granulation, and therefore conferring more a faster chemical reaction for the explosion, for the burning on powder. So we don't see basically anything massively and structurally done into the Mamluk Sultanate at this point, especially from a certain central government. Probably the Amir's armies were probably a bit more dynamic. I like to think about them because at the Battle of Raidaniya that we mentioned before, the it was said, I think, by Ottoman sources that eventually captured a lot of artillery during the battle, is that this artillery belonged chiefly to the houses of the amirs. It's very fascinating because also in Europe at this point there were a lot of noble houses that were starting and even kind of specializing in artillery. For instance, Ferrara into northern Italy was regarded as extremely advanced, and it was a kind of a modest power in artillery, and definitely they did it. So this idea, as I was saying before, that the more defragmented and chaotic the situation is from a political point of view, and the more the single power is gonna develop, because it has a much higher degree of risk, so it's investing much more in things like research, for instance. So these Mamluk amirs probably were kind of doing something like that, because it doesn't matter how the Sultanate was centralized, and we don't have to emphasize that so much, because yeah, talking about centralization still at this time is something you could say, yeah, it was relatively centralized compared to other powers. It was mostly still, from a modern perspective, a very decentralized system. So there were lots of amirs who were, especially, you can imagine these troublesome frontiers of the empire, were kind of developing their armed forces on their own. And by the way, also the Battle of Raidania proves this commitment of such private forces that had joined together to halt the Ottoman invasion. So they had a common aim together with the central power that was, obviously always rival to them in some measure. So what else can we say? What I found interesting is, however, the spread of firearms at a small bands level, and this begins to be seen actually during those wars between against the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, and also in certain expeditions. In fact, in Ijaz, where troops with armed with firearms were starting being brought. These were kind of bands of troops, kind of also enrolled, etc. So there is also a lot of naval warfare. You're gonna see these kind of firearms being increasingly used, because as I was saying before, there were other environments into which war was developing a bit on their own, and definitely maritime warfare at this time is pretty dynamic, and you see that also. Naval expenses are pretty costly, naturally, and these big powers have troubles at even investing resources for that. So the best way sometimes, even for these Mediterranean powers like Egypt or the Ottomans, was to pay for pirates to fight for them, maybe rewarding. And think about Barbarossa in the 16th century. Those were people who were I don't know, it's as if they lived a sort of very mixed, they had a very mixed background. They kind of got everything from the best. The Mediterranean had always this kind of pretty homogeneous maritime culture that entailed also the sharing of the technology, of tactics, etc. So sometimes naval power at this time was and piracy was developing more autonomously certain tactics, certain combat styles, let's say, that the major powers could just look at and say, okay, we pay you and just fight for us directly without making us create a fleet on our own. Definitely there were surely attempts to build fleets. At this time, the Mamluks didn't have a permanent navy, but they however built their own fleets at a point. And this happened, it was normal at the time, even with the Ottomans after that, it was like that really. Seemingly were even up to 150, 180 ships used in 1426 during the invasion of Cyprus. And these were seemingly just combat ships. This seems a freaking huge quantity of troops. So for saying that how many resources could be drawn from Egypt still at this time. But probably, however, other naval expeditions, especially the best equipped one, could count much less troops, like 15 or like 1/10. For instance, incidentally, the one that Sultan Yakmak sent in against Rhodes in 1400 were either 15 or 18. And Egypt also had very good ports. There were on the Mediterranean was definitely Alexandria, historically, and Bulak. And there was also Qusair on the Red Sea, for instance, always considered with this with the Egyptians. There is not just the Mediterranean, there is also the Indian Ocean. It was so fundamental, by the way, to protect trade, etc., because there was definitely a naval route that came from the east, and now especially the Portuguese were challenging. Another interesting fact of this is, for instance, at the Battle of Raidania, alongside with the artillery of the Amirs, there was also the artillery that had been sold by the Hospitallers of Rhodes to the Sultanate. Sometimes these Christian powers were pretty much involved even into the clashes between the same Muslim powers. Naturally, they backed one or the other according to convenience. The Hospitallers of Rhodes, sometimes they even backed the Ottoman Empire for sheer, for getting money from the process, and favoring in part the same ascent of the same rise of the Ottomans. So for now, I think that I've said more or less what I wanted to say. So you understand, it's well, we didn't talk much about tactics, etc., but we could do it perhaps. Definitely tactics at this time, as you imagine, involved a lot of cavalry warfare. So the tactics weren't that different from the one of other peoples. Usually, it was usually 5 divisions. So the center, the flank, and vanguard, the rear guard. It's pretty standard. That's pretty. It's usually the indicator of a pretty dynamic army, especially when it's made up by cavalry. So that you have many options open. You can really do a lot of things. You can maneuver a lot. A problem especially in Egypt, in other desertic areas or semi-desertic areas, was the problem of the sun and especially of sandstorms. So fighting it was very important during battle that the wind wouldn't blow on your face, because this would have this this would whip up these enormous clouds of sand or dust into the soldiers' faces, and this could be a severe tactical disadvantage, also because the horses at that point could have been, especially for cavalry warfare, because cavalry tactics require a freaking deal of coordination of order, etc. So if you have cavalrymen and horses that always have wind and sand in their on their faces, or sun on their faces, they can't keep alignment. They just stay there and they won't make order. So at that point, the Mamluks similarly were advised also by their manuals to dismount and fight on foot, preferably. So just think at how environmental conditions can obviously, however, influence the fighting style. One characteristic, if I'm not wrong, the Egyptian warfare, also in previous times, had been, always in medieval times, was the emphasis that was placed on the size of the ambush parties. Because normally ambushes, especially if you see how they were developed practically everywhere, let's say, but especially in the West during feudal warfare, you see that the troops were concealed for attacking the enemy, falling on the enemy's rears or flank during the battle, were usually like a very small shock power. It could be enough even to break entire formations of hundreds, to have a few tens of good elite soldiers to make what it took just to split the enemy formation in two. The Mamluks are said to have made a very large to have used a very large quantity of troops. And this is partly anecdotal in the sense that I don't fully believe it. I realize that probably also stereotypically a certain kind of the Mamluks had a lot of troops we've seen from light cavalry of every sort. So that is not if you have a lot of them, kind of makes sense also to attack en masse, and even without order sometimes, because even the sheer number is enough to frighten the enemy and to make it break. Actually, this is something that also the Byzantines use sometimes, etc. But obviously the problem is that the larger the ambush party is, and the easier it's going to be discovered. So I don't really know. This is usually told about the Mamluks, but I think that warfare was pretty standard at the time, and maybe, I don't know what I should read their sources, but unfortunately I don't know them pretty well. So, but I look at this with a slight criticism, because you can do it. You can conceal large amount of troops, but you also wouldn't be in the condition to do it, or in the maybe sometimes it wouldn't even make sense. However, actually the Mamluk military manuals are pretty detailed. They show actually a very sophisticated and advanced warfare that takes into consideration order, caution. It's typical of an advanced military, and there is nothing surprise about this. So even some details maybe in the sense are rightfully to be overlooked, in at least they're not to be taken literally, but there is a presence of feint flight, ambushes, flanking, everything really, and caution in the pursuit, because however, and there is also a space dedicated to the role of infantry in these battles, and there is also a big deal of emphasis placed on how to hold cavalry charges for the infantry, which was done like fixing, in my opinion, the legs on the ground, because there is this idea that spears had, in case of a cavalry charge, you had to kneel as an infantryman with a shield in the front and the spear held out from the upper part of the chest. So this sounds as if it was easier to to fix this the back of the bottom end of the spear on the ground, so that you wouldn't even need to physically absorb yourself the eventual weight of the horse and cavalryman that was charging at you, even assuming that he would do that. Because a big deal of these tactics was actually to prevent cavalry charges, not to actually sustain them. And while there was also this role of archers, and at the same time had to support the spearmen and to halt the enemy cavalry. So my idea is this was a very a much more dynamic world, we think, from a tactical point of view, because there was such a high variety especially of light troops, that necessarily required a lot of dynamism. There was also a lot of them, quantitatively speaking. So this may be another point. However, we have mentioned already for artillery that in the very last days of the Sultanate, there was some attempt of trying to move to add a bit of mobile character to firepower, and this was naturally a form of if the Sultanate had not perished, probably we would have assisted sooner or later to a transformation of the the Mamluk military into something more Renaissance-like. And I'm kind of convinced of this because it had the potential for doing that. Even if there had been a strong reformer, Egypt really had resources to even develop very interesting kind of pike-shot armies, I believe. This didn't happen eventually, and the Ottoman conquest brought to mostly... I'm not really aware of the military that existed into Egypt after the Ottoman conquest, but it's kind of obvious that the Ottomans kept to draw mercenaries and other troops. Partly probably also these Mamluks, I don't know, that they were also pretty rooted into the society. There were Mamluk families at this time, just like the Janissary families. There was a progressive gentrification of these slaves, as we have seen. So it's probably that there were many Egyptians also into Ottoman armies, as far as I know. And I will discuss this in when dealing especially with the Ottoman army in more detail. However, today was just this very, very easy, plain introduction about the Mamluk military at this time, and I promise I will go much more deep in detail as anything else. Some of you ask me sometimes, "Oh, will you talk about this period?" I will cover everything. I can go as far as India. In the East, relatively to medieval, especially warfare. So also the ancient times. I will cover every single thing. With time, I will do it. If I will keep make Schwerpunkt going on, I promise you it will be the case. So don't worry, everything will work just fine in the end. So, and for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.